Okay, welcome everybody. I am Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Coordinator. Thank you so much for joining us for our countdown event. The Walden Woods Project is a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts. We preserve the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Our organization was founded in 1990 by recording artist Don Henley, and this past April, we celebrated our 30th anniversary. Our first session with Bill Mckibben will begin shortly. After our session with Bill, our program will resume at 4:30. Myself and science journalist Evan Schwartz will be here to welcome everyone and to give brief introductions for the next speaker.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this historic day for tackling the climate crisis. Welcome.
Thanks, Evan. And before we start, just to go over some Zoom housekeeping, this is a Zoom webinar, so you're only able to see the host and the panelists. You can use the chat function at the bottom of the screen if you're having tech difficulties, and we will do our best to help you. There will be a live Q&A with Bill after his talk, so feel free to post any questions in the Q&A box that's also at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to all of them. And now Chris Anderson, the head of TED, and activist Lindsay Levin will give a brief overview of the Global Countdown Initiative.
Welcome to TEDx Countdown. This event is one of more than 500 mainly virtual gatherings taking place over these days and weeks in over 90 countries, all part of Countdown's global launch. But what on earth is Countdown, and what are we hoping to achieve?
Countdown is a massive collaboration to bring together every citizen of planet Earth who wants to do something about the single biggest crisis we face. From wildfires to hurricanes to flooding, our destabilized climate is already causing terrible damage. But the good news is there are many, many people working with creativity and determination to help us find our way through.
TED has never attempted anything at this scale before. We couldn't have made Countdown happen without the amazing TEDx community, including those who are joining us for the first time. We also couldn't have done it without the incredible partnership with Lindsay's group, Future Stewards, which brings together many people and organizations right at the forefront of the battle against climate change. Honestly, seeing everyone come together to make today possible has been unbelievably exciting and heartwarming.
When we think about the challenge of climate change, two things stand out starkly. One, we've pushed our home, the Earth, to its limits. Two, today's crises are all interconnected. The climate crisis is also a health crisis because of the dirty air and polluted water that sickens or kills millions of people every year. It's a crisis of equity, justice, and livelihoods, with the most vulnerable being the most affected. And it's a crisis of purpose and meaning.
Our goal is that all of us will walk away with a clear picture of what it will take to tackle this terrifying problem. Because although it's really complicated, there's actually a simple way to think about it. We, Earth citizens, have to stop sending greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and we have to figure out ways of reabsorbing the excess emissions that are already up there. Picture it this way. Our beautiful planet is being overheated by a pollution blanket of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. When you zoom in, that pollution is coming from 5 major sectors: energy, transport, industry, food, and our misuse of nature. Scientists agree that we have to cut our emissions in half in the next 10 years. That's what Countdown means. Count emissions down. And at the same time that we're doing that, we're counting down to a clean, beautiful, exciting future.
What excites me most about Countdown is the chance to invite people everywhere to ask the same question. How can we make a difference? To discover that instead of feeling hopeless and helpless, we can actually do this. Yes, it's urgent. Yes, it's serious, but there's real momentum underway, not spoken about nearly enough. We are poised on the edge of a revolution in innovation and job creation. This is an amazing moment because we all get to decide. What do we stand for? Do we love ourselves and our home enough to preserve it for the future? I believe we do. It's at once a burden and a sacred privilege, and it's ours to do.
If you'll commit this time, we think this is a day you could remember for the rest of your lives. Thank you so much for being part of it. And so, let the countdown begin.
Okay, thank you, Chris and Lindsay. And now over to Kathy Anderson, the WWP Executive Director, who will introduce Bill Mckibben.
Thank you, Sarah. On behalf of the Walden Woods Project, I want to extend our appreciation to all of you for participating in today's TEDx on the existential threat of climate change. We have a great program ahead with insightful and inspiring presentations. To expand on Sarah's description of the Walden Woods Project, our organization is continually developing free virtual discussions and lectures for a global audience, linking Henry David Thoreau's life and legacy to current global challenges, including climate change, biodiversity, civic engagement, and social reform. For 3 decades, our nonprofit organization has been leading the fight to save key sites in Walden Woods from commercial development. During the COVID crisis, an unprecedented number of people have visited the extensive acreage and public trails we steward. The Walden Woods Project's continuing land conservation efforts have never been more important. And for those who are not able to visit Walden Woods, we have recently launched a new app, so you can take an informative virtual tour around Walden Pond. Search for the Walden Pond and Woods Guide in the Apple or Google Store to download the free app. We recognize that these are difficult economic times, but I hope you will consider making a modest contribution to help support our virtual programs and land conservation during the challenging months ahead. A gift at any level would be profoundly appreciated. Now it is my pleasure to introduce an award-winning author, environmentalist, and journalist, Bill Mckibben, someone I have known and admired since I read his 1989 book, The End of Nature, often referred to as the first book about global warming written for a general audience. Bill has gone on to write many more books, the most recent being Falter, named by the Washington Post as one of the 10 best books of 2019. If you haven't already read Falter, I encourage you to do so. It's been described as a powerful and sobering call to arms to save not only our planet, but our humanity. Bill Mckibben serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College, as a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he has won the Gandhi Peace Prize, as well as honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He helped found 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign, and has organized on every continent, including Antarctica, for climate action. He played a leading role in launching the opposition to big oil pipeline projects and the fossil fuel divestment campaign, which has become the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history. This year, Bill left the board of 350.org and stepped down from his volunteer role as senior advisor, accepting emeritus status. He remains one of the most engaged, respected, and effective leaders of our time in the global climate campaign. Please join me in welcoming Bill Mckibben.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it brings back many, many memories of all the times we've gotten to work together over the years. And it's a real pleasure to think of you all down there in Concord, hard at work. You know, I grew up across the town line in Lexington, spent a lot of time wandering around Walden Pond as a boy and swimming in its limpid waters. And I can imagine that right this weekend, as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, it's probably the leaves at just about peak there, and the beautiful birch and beech and maple just putting on a tremendous show. I'm grateful that you asked me to join you here today. I'll confess that I don't normally do this sort of TED Talk thing because it's a tiny bit too shiny and upbeat for someone like me. So I'm very happy to do it under the cover of cranky, grumpy old Mr. Thoreau, who lets us all, lets us all be both idealistic and realistic at the same time. Getting to edit an edition of Walden many, many decades ago was one of the most interesting years I ever spent just living in the company of Henry David. And I think it changed me ever since, and I'm always happy for the chance to get to join in the great work of Walden Woods, to see the way that that area has been preserved and enhanced is a great joy always when I'm back towards my home. So let's talk about where we are right now. This is going to be an excellent series of events, and we might as well set the stage a little bit. I did write the first book for a general audience about climate change 31 years ago when I was 28, The End of Nature. And at the time, we knew more or less what was coming down the pike. There was no huge mystery. When you burn coal and gas and oil, you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Its molecular structure traps heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. Same with methane, CH4, natural gas. If it escapes unburned into the atmosphere, it too traps heat. And since both these chemicals were spiking in the atmosphere, it was a pretty good guess that the temperature was soon going to begin to rise with difficult effect. Really, the only things we didn't know 30 years ago were A, what kind of effect this was going to have on the oceans. People hadn't understood the challenge presented by ocean acidification. And B, we didn't understand quite how fast all of this was going to happen. Scientists, by their nature, are conservative, and so the predictions came true faster than we would have expected. And at this point, obviously, everybody knows that we're no longer talking about a prospective threat. We're talking about something that is very much ongoing. Just to do the math most basically, so far human beings have raised the temperature of the planet 1 degree. That doesn't sound like an enormous amount, 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's, 60 degrees when you walk outside today and 62 by the time you finish your walk, no one will be able to tell that difference. The extra heat that we're trapping, again, seems like a small quantity. It's about 3/4 of a watt per square meter of the planet's surface. So less than one of those small white Christmas tree lights per square meter. But it turns out there are a lot of square meters on planet Earth. So if you measure it in other terms, you begin to get a sense of just what damage we're doing. The extra heat that we trap because of the coal and gas and oil that we've burned, that extra heat is the heat equivalent of about 4 Hiroshima-sized explosions a second. Okay? And that extra heat has been enough to do incredibly large things, the largest things by far that human beings have ever done. We've melted half the sea ice in the summer Arctic. We've seemed to have fundamentally destabilized certainly the Greenland ice shelf and probably the big ice shelves of the Antarctic. We've begun raising sea levels, and fairly dramatically. We have made it possible to have more powerful storms than we have yet observed on this planet, because storms over the ocean draw their strength from the heat in the top layers of the ocean surface, and those top layers are now hotter. We should very much bear in our minds and our hearts today the people dealing with Hurricane Delta, the 10th, I believe, landfalling named storm that we've dealt with in the United States this year. We're obviously through the regular alphabet and onto the Greek alphabet for storms. We've been way ahead of the record pace all year. We've seen dramatic changes in the way that water moves around the planet. If you want one thing to kind of bear in mind to understand the global warming era, it's that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. So in arid, dry areas, we see more evaporation. And when you get more evaporation with high heat, then you get wildfire. Look at Australia at the beginning of this year. Look at California over the last couple of months. First, California recorded the highest temperature ever reliably measured on our planet, 130 degrees in August. It was no surprise then that forests began to burn, because even a few weeks of temperatures like that dry out the woods so much that they become a tinderbox. And at the moment, of course, 5 of the 10 largest fires in California history are currently burning, as are the largest fires probably ever in Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil, where record heat across those parts of South America has helped trigger a remarkable onslaught of fire in some of the most beautiful areas in the world. Once that water vapor has evaporated up into the atmosphere, it's going to come down, and we already see that happening. Storms that drop more than 2 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, the kind of gully washers that do no one any good and farmers a good deal of harm, they've grown about 75% in the Northeast United States. We've had the largest rainfalls ever recorded in the US over the last couple of years. Most remarkably, Hurricane Harvey in Texas, which dropped more than 5 feet of rain on parts of Houston. These are the changes that we see, as I said before, with 1 degree Celsius of global warming. So the scary part of this story is that we're still near the beginning of the climate change saga. Even if we do everything right at this point, it's going to be very hard to hold temperature increases much below 2 degrees Celsius. And if we manage that trick, it's not that it'll be twice as bad as it is now. It'll be considerably worse than that, because change is exponential, not linear, as you begin to pass tipping points. In fact, at the moment, our trajectory has us headed for a 3 or 3.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, even if we kept the promises that we made at Paris. And of course, some countries, one country in particular, has officially decided not to keep those promises, indeed to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords altogether. So if we let that happen, if we see a temperature increase of 3 or 3.5 or 4 degrees Celsius, which, as I say, is where we're currently headed, by most accounts, we won't be able to have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. That's just that. It's too hot, too much disruption, too much violent physical change. Our job is to keep that from happening and to do it swiftly, because, as people said in the introduction, we know that we only have a very short period of time in which to make this happen. The IPCC, the world's climate scientists, in their last report in 2018, set 2030 as a hard deadline. If we haven't cut emissions in half by then, our chances of meeting the targets that we so bravely set in Paris just 5 years ago are essentially nil. So that is a large measure of bad news. And I will now attempt to leaven it with a little bit of good news. There are two things that have happened over the last 10 years that give us the chance, perhaps, of finding our way out of this cul-de-sac. The first, we have to thank the engineers and scientists for doing an amazing job. Over the last decade, the price of solar power and wind power has dropped about 90%. And now the cost of storage batteries is on the same downward trajectory. This is an astonishing change. It meant that sun and wind have gone from being alternative energy to being by far the cheapest way to generate power around this planet. And the places that have taken advantage of that are demonstrating every day what it means. There are some countries around the planet now running entirely on renewable energy. The British this week announced plans to see if they could get every bit of their electricity running off offshore wind within the next 10 years, on and on and on. Those changes are possible, but they're not going to happen fast enough based on economics alone to get us where we need to go, because we have this huge, vast built infrastructure of fossil fuels that's going to keep on in kind of zombie fashion producing carbon for decades to come unless we retire it, unless we move very swiftly in a new direction. And we can see signs of the possibility that that could happen. It was big news 2 weeks ago when the governor of California announced that the Golden State would not be selling internal combustion engines in cars and trucks past 2035. Big news because it acknowledges that these are technologies mature enough now, electric vehicles, to take up that slack, but also big news because California is really where car culture was invented, convertibles and muscle cars and dune buggies and all the other things that we learned to love. That's where they reached their zenith. So it's big news and a big possible change. If we're to make that change in time, it will be because we also come together in support of the other thing that's happened over the last 10 years. And that's been the emergence of a global movement around climate change that's big enough to begin pushing back against the fossil fuel industry. That pushback's completely required. This 10 years ago was the biggest, richest, most influential industry on the planet. And we now know that it's also the most irresponsible. That we know because of great investigative reporting by all sorts of people looking at archives and talking with whistleblowers, that the fossil fuel industry knew everything there was to know about climate change long ago. Knew it back when I was writing about this in the 1980s. If you think about it, it makes obvious sense. Exxon was the biggest company in the world then by quite a margin. A great team of scientists. Their product was carbon. Of course they were going to find out, and they did. Their scientists told their executives with stunning specificity what the temperature and CO2 concentration would be in 2020. They were right on, and they were believed. Exxon, for instance, began building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was in the offing. But what they didn't do was tell any of the rest of us. Instead, they attempted to lull us to sleep with a massive and expensive industry-wide disinformation campaign. They brought on board the people who'd worked for the tobacco industry, some of the same people who'd smeared Rachel Carson in the wake of Silent Spring. And together they set to work to try and convince Americans that there was doubt about the science or that there was no grave threat that we faced or anything else. Their efforts were, for many years, very successful. You can measure their success by the fact that we went from a world where the Republican president in 1988, George H.W. Bush, said, we must fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect, to a Republican president in 2020 who believes that climate change is a hoax manufactured by the Chinese. That they were able to, that shift has happened even as the science has become endlessly more sure and clear and certain, is a reminder of just how much damage you can do if you're as rich and as ruthless as the oil industry has been. But people have risen up to challenge them. There is a global movement, perhaps the biggest global movement ever now, that is taking on this industry, trying to soften it up so we can make the rational change that science requires. It's been a pleasure to be part of that. 350.org was the first iteration, maybe a kind of beta test of what a global climate campaign would look like. We sponsored the first global day of climate action in 2009, when we had 5,200 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political activity in the planet's history, but most of those were small demonstrations. 100 people here, 200 people there. You have to begin somewhere. And the great pleasure of the last decade has been watching so many people flood in to do this work. We take no credit for it, but we take great delight in it. Watching groups like Extinction Rebellion or the Sunrise Movement, progenitors of the Green New Deal, or in certain ways, most beautifully of all, the rise of the junior high and high school climate strikers, inspired by Greta Thunberg, but there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs scattered around the world and 10 million followers of them who are pushing hard. And this is precisely what we need. Because to be truthful, we've never really lacked for the set of answers, technological or policy answers, that we need to deal with this predicament. What we've lacked is political will, the ability to beat back the political power of the fossil fuel industry. And finally, after 10 hard, long years of work around the world, we're getting there. We see in place after place that countries and continents are deciding to respond to the economic turmoil of the pandemic with plans for broad, sweeping green recoveries. The EU has put forward plans over the last few weeks to cut emissions 60% by 2030, for instance. The Chinese have pledged to go net zero as a nation by sometime in the middle of the century. And I think it's possible that even in this country, center of fossil fuel addiction, center of climate denial, center of fossil fuel corporate power, that if the election goes as some of us hope it will go in November, it will be clear that the industry is no longer the titan that it once was, able by itself to derail climate policy. I think we'll see a strong good faith effort to at least start down the path we've never traveled before towards federal climate action. You all got a little sense in Massachusetts of what that desire for change looked like just watching the Democratic senatorial primary that took place there earlier this year. On the basis of his name, Joe Kennedy was 17 points ahead when that race began. But young people in particular, and people moved by Ed Markey's support for the Green New Deal, rallied to deliver him a crushing victory in that fight. And it's that, when I say that we're building movement power, that's what it looks like. So I don't want to rattle on forever because I hope that we have some questions and things, But I do want to make a couple of points that come out of the odd, bitter, interesting experience of this past year with the pandemic. I think that, I mean, look, this didn't solve the greenhouse gases problem, didn't solve global warming, which is interesting because it did change our lives in ways that none of us had ever imagined. I mean, this has obviously been the most anomalous year in the life of any American, at least who came of age after the Second World War. This has been an astonishing year of change with people upending their lives. And at the height of it in the spring, emissions fell something on the order of 8 or 9%, which is not nothing. It's a good sign that individual change can make a difference. But it's also not all that much. And it's a reminder that most of the trouble we face is hardwired into the system in which we live, and we're going to have to reach into that system and pull out the coal and gas and oil and put in a lot of insulation and a lot of conservation and a lot of sun and wind in order to make change on the scale we need. The pandemic, I think, should remind us of three things. One, physical reality matters. Look, it obviously doesn't matter if the president gets up and insists that COVID is a hoax or it's going to go away by Easter or whatever. His bluster wasn't even enough to protect him, much less the, closing in on 250,000 Americans who died of this thing. Just as I've been trying to explain to people for 30 years that physics and chemistry don't compromise, so true with biology. If the microbe says stand 6 feet apart, stand 6 feet apart. It's a good and useful reminder about physical reality. It is easy to forget in a world where we lead very abstracted lives, buried behind screens so much of the time. Second lesson, speed often really matters when we're dealing with things. The US and South Korea, as Kamala Harris pointed out the other night, had their first case of COVID on the same day in January. South Koreans went right to work, did what needed doing, tested people, changed lifestyles some, though not as much as we had to. And as a result, they basically are looking at this in the rearview mirror now. The US, as we now know, did precisely the opposite, even though, thanks to Bob Woodward, we understand that everybody knew, even at the top, what the threat was. But we wasted February and the first part of March doing nothing. And as a result, things got entirely out of control, and the US has by far the highest death toll of any place on the planet. For February and March in the climate record, read the last 30 years, when we ignored clear, obvious, actionable warnings from scientists and went about our merry way. And the result is the same. We fail to flatten both curves, and we pay a very high price. It's a reminder, a strong kick in the gut reminder, that now we really do need to work with extraordinary rapidity. Having wasted the last 30 years, we have to cram most of the effort that should have spanned 4 decades into 1 decade. That'll be extremely difficult, and it'll require huge focus at global, national, state, local levels, and in our individual lives to get things done fast. The third lesson of the pandemic, it seems to me, perhaps the most important, is that social solidarity really matters. Most of us, people my age, grew up in the kind of political shadow of Ronald Reagan and the insistence that markets were going to solve problems for us, and that government, as he put it, was not the problem, it was the solution. Not the solution, it was the problem. Indeed, Reagan's big laugh line in his speeches was always, oh, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Ha ha ha. Turns out that the scariest words in the English language are things like, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house caught on fire. And those you solve by coming together, by having governments that are competent and funded enough to do the jobs that we need to do as citizens, not as consumers, as a collective, not as individuals. And I think that that lesson got even stronger as the year wore on, and we began on this latest very powerful round of attempting a kind of racial reckoning in this society. The most important words that anyone said in 2020 were from George Floyd as he was being murdered, when he said, I can't breathe. People can't breathe for a lot of reasons. They can't breathe because there's a cop kneeling on their neck, or because police brutality stifles their communities. They can't breathe because they've got COVID and their lungs are filled up. And we know enough by now to know that COVID follows the same well-worn tracks of race and class that so many other afflictions in our society do. People can't breathe because there's a coal-fired power plant down the street or a natural gas compressor station. And we know what communities those are likely to be in. People can't breathe because wildfire smoke has gotten so terrible that the authorities in their community have told them to go inside their homes and tape their windows shut in an effort to keep the particulates out of their lungs. People can't breathe because it's just gotten too hot. That 130-degree temperature won't be the record for long, and there's large parts of the planet where it will become more and more and more a rule rather than an exception. We're building now a planet that humans can't survive on in the ways we're used to, can't thrive on in the ways that we would like to. We're overwhelming that planet. And so we need very quickly to figure out how to step back and behave quite differently. In fact, I think it's not hyperbole to say that we're really reaching the last moments when we get to make those decisions with the hope that they'll have much effect. My reading of the science is that the next decade represents the last time when we have real leverage over how hot the temperature is actually going to get. What we do over the next 10 years will determine which tipping points we pass and how much kind of vicious cycle warming gets unleashed. I'm quite scared already. I mean, the pictures this summer that scared me the most came not from California, they came from Siberia, where we had truly massive fires for the 4th year in a row, and where they were now clearly burning into the vast peatlands of that northern boreal expanse. That's terrifying because there's an awful lot of carbon up in there. These are the kind of things we have to, at any cost, avert, because there is no amount of money that can cope with the trouble that we're unleashing, and no amount of human pain that will ever be produced by anything else on anything like the same scale. The UN estimates that we could see 1 billion climate refugees before this century is out. And so if we act, we should act now, and we should act decisively. And since we're talking about Mr. Thoreau, let's talk about the other great invention of the 20th century. Alongside the solar panel, which I think has the chance to save us, which is magic technology. The fact that you can point a sheet of glass at the sun and out the back flows light and cold and information and modernity. That's, that's Hogwarts scale magic. But the other great invention of the 20th century, for my money, was the nonviolent social movement. People like Gandhi drawing very directly on the example that Henry set in the jailhouse in Concord, built this idea of nonviolent direct action that is the best tool we know about for allowing the small and the many to stand up to the mighty and the few. I don't mean just civil disobedience and going to jail, though sometimes that's a part of it. I mean all the work of movement building. And as we have unrolled this effort in the climate world over the last decade, we've seen its strength. We've seen people, many people on this call, come together to do things like stop giant pipeline projects, including big wins in Massachusetts, for which many congratulations. And we've seen many, many people come together to build this vast fossil fuel divestment campaign that has challenged the ability of this industry to go on finding the capital it needs to keep its insidious expansion underway. That effort's become the largest corporate campaign in history. We're at $15 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole from fossil fuel. And they include huge operations, the pension funds of places like New York City, all the public accounts of the Republic of Ireland, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the biggest pool of investment capital on planet Earth at $1 trillion. It includes religious denominations around the world. And it includes some of our greatest universities, including in the last few weeks, Oxford and Cambridge, who have joined in. Does not include state of Massachusetts pension fund, despite the great efforts of groups like 350 Massachusetts and the Better Future Project to make that happen. And it doesn't include, and I will say that this frosts me, it does not include institutions like Harvard University, the richest university on this continent, richest university in the world, which continues to try and profit off global warming. A fool's errand in every way. So there's plenty of work to be done to keep pushing and keep pushing hard. And we need people engaged in that work. We need it engaged in that work above all else. Look, there are lots of things you can do in your own house and your own neighborhood to make change. I'm very proud of the solar panels on my roof that are powering this conversation. I'm proud of the electric car in the garage that I can run directly off the sun, on and on. But I do not try to fool myself that that's how we're going to win this fight. Given the amount of time we have, only basic changes in political and economic structures that allow us to move quickly have any hope of letting us catch up to climate change. And so I think it's clear that the most important thing an individual can do is be a lot less of an individual. Join together with others in movements large enough to make change happen fast. Even with that, there's no guarantee that we will get where we need to go. We've unleashed a physical process on this planet there are scientists who think we've waited too long. The best science indicates we still have a window, and a narrow one and a closing one, not to stop global warming, but to keep it from getting entirely out of hand. And if they're correct in that, then there is no calling higher, no job on which to spend our energy more over the next decade. I'm so grateful to everyone who has been involved in this fight, especially the people at Walden Woods who've been strong on it from their beginning. And I am really hopeful that we are able, in many ways, to make incredible progress in the decade ahead, and then allow ourselves to sit back for a minute and see where we are and what the next round of change will need to look like. So thank you enormously.
Thanks, Bill. Everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Yep, okay. I know people are eager to ask their questions. We've gotten a handful already. So as a reminder, folks, just type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I'll do my best to get to as many as I can. So the first question for you, Bill, do you have any suggestions on how to take politics out of climate change? The discussion of climate change, realizing it eventually gets back to that because of the connection to public policy. But politics is so divisive these days, the starting point might be somewhere else.
I'm afraid there is no way to take politics out of this. There should be, conservation and the environment were at least somewhat bipartisan effort for much of the 20th century. But that ended some point in the last 25 years or so, when the fossil fuel industry basically purchased one of our political parties. The Koch brothers, our biggest oil and gas barons, became by far the largest players in our political system. Their network, I read yesterday, is spending $170 million at the moment on the current Supreme Court nomination fight. And so they managed to, well, I mean, look, you don't need me to tell you, they managed to coerce an entire party full of lawmakers into acting far dumber than they actually are. Very few people really believe that climate change is a hoax manufactured by the Chinese or a plot to, whatever it is. But people have to keep saying that because that's where they are. Now, the political calculation may change after the next election, depending what it comes out like. And increasingly, I think it's becoming dangerous for politicians to act as ignorantly as they have. So let's hope that that's one of the results of November 3rd. But in the meantime, two things. Don't depend entirely on the political system to be making these changes. We need to pressure hard our financial system as well. We've done a lot of work around this with what we've been calling stopthemoneypipeline.com, putting big pressure on Chase Bank, say, or BlackRock to make big changes in their climate policy. And that's begun to yield some real change. I began January by getting arrested at the Chase branch nearest the Capitol with Jane Fonda on the other side of the glass cheering us on. And so it was with pleasure that we noted yesterday that Chase had announced that it was trying to become a Paris-aligned bank. Now, that doesn't mean all that much yet. We don't know quite what it's going to mean in practice. What it means, though, is that we should keep pressuring the hell out of these guys in order to get change to happen. The other thing I'd say is that one piece of good news is that the solutions to the problems we face do have wide support across our political spectrum. If you poll Republicans, Independents, and Democrats, you find about an 80% support level in all three categories for more government intervention to bring on renewable energy. Everybody likes solar panels for different reasons. Conservatives, I think, sometimes think, well, if I have a solar panel on my roof, my home will be entirely my castle and I'll never have to depend on anyone ever again. And, liberals think, oh, the groovy power of the sun is lighting up my life and whatever. It's all good. We can work with that. So I hope that there's some ways forward together once we crush the political power of the fossil fuel industry.
Awesome. Next question. Sadly, you confirmed my fear that our lower energy use during the pandemic thus far really didn't make the changes on the scale that we desperately needed. Is there a way to build on this opening and enact the most critical tasks we need to accomplish for the planet?
So the biggest opening from the pandemic, frankly, may be the degree to which, in part because of the incompetence of the administration, we've managed to trash our economy. So we come out of this year with levels of unemployment like we haven't seen since the Great Depression. And hence the possibility for a New Deal is greater than it's been. And what do you know? We have a New Deal sitting around ready to go. That's this Green New Deal proposal that Massachusetts Senator Markey was one of the principal authors of. It's not going to be adopted lock, stock, and barrel, but it comes with a lot of ideas that would allow us to dramatically transform our energy system, our buildings, our agriculture, and do it in ways that would put back to work those people who've been put out of work.
We did get a question about the Green New Deal as well. You might not be able to fully answer this question because it might be a little lengthy, but point by point, please articulate the metrics and costs of the Green New Deal, which has become a dog whistle to frighten voters that worry about tax increases and too much government in their lives. What don't you like, if anything, about the Green New Deal?
Yeah, I mean, the Republicans think it's a dog whistle that frightens everybody, but in fact, the polling shows just the opposite. People are eager for big, strong, broad action here, and and so I don't want to play that game. I think it's mostly a super sensible set of solutions. Having said that, people sometimes say, well, it's too big, it's too all-encompassing. You know, yeah, it's big. What do you expect when you ignore a problem for 30 years? That's it's like saying, well, you know, I decided to keep smoking for 30 years. So now, instead of having to get a nicotine patch, I have to get lung surgery. Yeah, that's what happens if you ignore a problem for 30 years. What do you know? It gets bigger and bigger. And so the solutions that you need to solve it get bigger and bigger. Remember, climate change is the first really time-limited crisis that human beings have come up against. Most of our political problems we can take a bite out of now and come back 10 years later and get some more, and so on and so forth. But climate change isn't like that. If we don't solve it quickly, then we don't solve it. So I think that the young people who wrote the Green New Deal, many of whom I know because they tend to be veterans of the campus divestment movement who've gone on to do this work through the Sunrise movement in the larger political world, I think they're basically right on.
Yeah. Okay, great. Moving on from Green New Deal, do you worry that vastly increased battery use will lead to new types of environmental disruption?
Sure. There is no free lunch here, and we're in the business now of figuring out which problem is worse than which other problem. We're getting better at building renewable technology, solar panels, batteries, more cleanly, and we should keep pushing to do that. But the damage that they'll cause is real. It's not as real nor anywhere near as large as the damage that we're causing if we don't get this rise in temperature under control. People need to have a sense of the scale here. On current trajectories, increasing the temperature 2, 3, 4 degrees Celsius, we're talking about changes to our Earth as large as when that huge asteroid slammed into us 60 or 70 million years ago. Those are the only disruption in our root. So 2 and 3 bring out to stop burning that coal and oil, and there's no way around the sun, wind.
kind of breaking up a little bit, Bill, but
Sarah, sorry, I couldn't hear you for a minute there.
oh, I said you were breaking up a little bit, but it seems to be sorting itself out. Can you still hear me? Let's see.
Okay, good. I can hear you now.
Okay.
I can, yeah.
Okay. So the next question, do you see any connection or use for the fairly new CRISPR technologies?
We're talking about CRISPR technology and about for which Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier just won the Nobel Prize this week, and congratulations to them. I think there's endless uses of CRISPR technology, but as I wrote in Falter, I think that would be a very good idea to steer away from the one set of uses that offer the most potential for abuse, and that is human genetic engineering, heritable human genetic engineering. I think we should avoid, for reasons that I lay out at length in that book. It seems to me that these feel like the existential scale changes that climate change felt like 30 years ago. This time we should have the discussion before, not after.
Mm-hmm. So, you mentioned the need for collaborative action. What are your thoughts on how we can inspire climate actions as part of everyone's daily lives? What are some examples of organizing at the neighborhood level that may have made a big difference for climate mitigation?
Well, there's been great examples of organizing at the neighborhood level and the state level in Massachusetts to do things like stop pipelines. I'm really grateful to the people, for instance, who've been standing up to this Weymouth compressor station and trying to stop the construction of new natural gas infrastructure across the Bay State. Could not be more important. There's plenty of things that people can do in their communities to help, and we know what most of these things are. Help others to transport themselves in less carbon intensive ways. So, standing up for bike paths. Although, since I'm currently sitting here in a sling, I may not be the best advocate for bike transportation. Do wear your helmets. People can help with local agriculture, all of that. But the point I was trying to make before is, do not anticipate that these kind of changes will add up fast enough from the bottom up to take care of this problem. It's a very good idea to do them, but a very good idea too to make sure that you're working on at a more systemic level to change the balance of power here. One thing that people in Massachusetts could certainly do is join with the people at 350 Massachusetts in demanding that the state's pension funds divest from fossil fuel. That would be a huge step.
Yep. And in relation to fracking, Biden seems adamant to support it. Do you have anything to say about that?
I don't think Biden is adamant to support it, frankly. His ability to control whether or not people can go frack is limited. The place where he does have control is on federal lands, and they've said that there will be no oil drilling or new gas drilling on federal lands beginning the day he takes office, which would be a big deal. US public lands are the 5th largest source of carbon in the world. So that would be a quick change. There are a lot of other ways that the president may be able to rein in fracking over time by doing things like enforcing the regulations against methane emissions that Trump has utterly gutted, stuff like that. But I got to say, for my money, Biden's done a pretty good job of listening to the climate movement. I know the people that Bernie appointed to be on the committee with Biden's people to work out a climate plan. They included AOC, and they included the wonderful Massachusetts native Varshini Prakash from East Boston, who's the head of the Sunrise Movement. And I think that the work that they all agreed on was pretty powerful. So, I mean, this is what happens when you build movements then you change where the consensus lies. You open up space for politicians to be braver. And that's the work we're going to have to continue to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How do we drive the energy industry to replace petroleum, oil, coal-centric jobs with renewable energy-centric jobs? How can we drive them to change their scope?
So I think it's an open question whether any of the big incumbent players, the big oil companies, actually are going to be the ones making this transition. They've waited a long time and their expertise does not lie here. It's pretty rare in historical times when one incumbent survives to dominate the next technology. I mean, the guys who made, buggies for horses were not the same guys who ended up building cars. That said, we have to figure out ways for workers to make that transition. And that's part of what the Green New Deal envisions. And to some extent, it's beginning to happen. I wrote in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago about the way that across North Dakota, where the oil bust has put many thousands of people out of work, they're retraining a lot of them as wind turbine technicians. The skill sets overlap pretty well, and people find that it's actually a much saner job and one that's not subject to the same kind of busts and booms going forward.
Great. This next question kind of answers or covers a few of the questions. So there is so much focus, and rightly so, on fossil fuels in the global warming conversation, but there seems to be an absence of conversation about livestock and domesticated animals as food sources from the consideration about how we address this crisis. What are your thoughts on the cows, pigs, chickens contribution to global warming?
So it's important. It's really important. The best estimate is that it's about 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions are related to agriculture, and the majority of that to livestock, and really the vast majority of that to cattle, to cows. And so, a very good idea to eat lower on the food chain, and particularly to avoid beef. And B, there's interesting work beginning to emerge about the ways in which we could rejigger our kind of corporate farming model to ways that would allow us to be improving soils in profound ways and helping them soak up carbon. So there's groups like Soil for Climate that have begun to do a good job bringing this stuff forward, and people should pay attention to them. It's really important to be sucking up carbon because we've already got too much in the atmosphere. And soil is one way of doing that. Another is forests. We should be working very hard to protect forests, intact forests, because they're such a store of carbon, and because old trees, as they grow, soak up even more carbon than young ones. It's why it's been fun to work with people in Massachusetts to try and get the legislature to back off the idea that biomass represents some kind of going future, because it doesn't. We need trees standing, not cut down to generate electricity. So in all these places, we need to look at how nature can help us soak up the millions of years worth of biology that we spilled into the air in the course of just a few decades.
Awesome. Yep, we just got a question if you could discuss proforestation, which you just did. Regenerating agriculture to store and sequester carbon. So if you have anything else.
Sure. So people to watch, really important people to pay attention to who are doing good writing around all these questions on soil. I already talked about Soil for Climate. Also look at the people at places like the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas. For forestation, the most interesting research work, I think, is being done by someone in Massachusetts. Bill Mumma from Tufts has really been working a lot of this science really well. And the Woodwell Research Institute out in Woods Hole is one of the places where people have done a lot of work about where carbon sinks are in the temperate forest and how they work. So there's good science going on here. The one problem with taking on all these things, the thing that makes it hard is just from a kind of logistical standpoint. Look, we've been fighting the oil industry. That's plenty hard because these guys are super powerful, but there's only a dozen players, you know. Your target set is limited. There's 1 billion farmers on the planet, so it's hard to change cultural and agricultural practices sharply and quickly. And it'll take a lot of effort over a lot of time, which happily people are beginning to put in.
Mm-hmm. We are narrowing down on our time, folks, so if you do have any more questions, type them into the Q&A box. I'll try to get to them. We'll probably just do a few more. This one is, how can you change the perception that taking an environmental path equals job loss and economic disaster?
I don't think that there's that many people who think that anymore. But if there are, you need to keep reminding them of several things. One, the real economic disaster is obviously allowing climate change to go unchecked. The latest data I saw said that by the end of the century, unchecked climate change would be doing damage of about $551 trillion, which is considerably more money than currently exists on planet Earth, okay? Second thing is, if you're worried about jobs, what's your other candidate for where you're going to generate a lot of them in the decade ahead? It seems to me that the transition off one energy source and onto another is the greatest opportunity for jobs growth that we've ever seen, especially since fossil fuel is capital intensive and renewable energy is labor intensive. Those solar panels don't mount themselves up on the roof by themselves. Nobody's going to send their house to China to get it properly insulated. That's work that has to be done here. And so it's a real opportunity for just that kind of change.
Awesome. A few people are asking if you have anything to say about ocean pollution. Kind of.
Yeah. So it comes in many forms. First thing to say is, it would be a huge help to be cutting out single-use plastic the best we can, because it's one of the places where the oil industry and the gas industry are trying to take the fossil fuel that we no longer really need for driving cars and heating homes and finding something else to do with them. And one byproduct of that ridiculous plan is that we fill the oceans with plastic too. The other kind of ocean pollution that really should terrify us is the rapid acidification and heating of the oceans. These things are enormous in scale. They're taking a huge toll. The best guess is that at this point, it's probably too late to save more than a remnant of the world's coral reefs, which is an enormous shame. These are one of the greatest ecosystems on our planet. So let that be a lesson to us. Let that be the canary, as it were, reminding us to shut down every coal mine we can.
Great. And I think this will be a great last question. You did cover it a little bit in your talk, but in understanding the relationship between forest fires and climate change, are there any recommended resources that you could help that could help folks learn more about it in greater detail?
There's been a lot of good work on fire and it's, you know, what it is that is causing the big uptick in fire. Above all, it's the steady rise in temperature. The wildfire season in much of the American West now lasts pretty much all year round. 2 years ago, we had massive fires in California in December into January. Even in the areas in the world where snow has always put out fire, in Siberia this year, there seemed to be a lot of fires that started very early in the spring, probably because they'd been burning slowly underground, even under the cover of snow, and simply reignited as soon as that snow cover was gone. So fire is a very scary manifestation of where we are, and it's a very big feedback loop on its own. And there are good people writing about it, Stephen Pine, others who are providing us with a lot of information. None of it particularly heartening. Clearly, job one is to try and hold the increase in temperature as low as we can.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill, for this insightful presentation and generous Q&A. I think that wraps it up.
A great pleasure for me, Sarah. Thanks to you, thanks to Evan, thanks to Kathy, not only for today, but for all the work that you do all the time. And it's a great pleasure to get to join you and help out a little.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Bill. And
Take care.
thanks everyone for joining. Please come back at 4:30 for the second half of the show. You can use the link provided in the registration email to get back on. And as a reminder, the Walden Woods Project is a nonprofit. We know the pandemic has been challenging for many organizations and people, so we appreciate any donation if you're able to make one at walden.org, and that donation link is in the chat box. Again, thank you all so much, and we'll see hopefully all of you back at 4:30.